ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the last session of the ICANN APAC TWNIC Engagement Forum. At this forum, we'll have a workshop that is topics that focus on the DNS abuse. So please welcome the host, David Conrad, the CTO from ICANN, and Champika, the Regional SSR Engagement Manager of ICANN.
Good afternoon, everyone. Last session of the day, always the one to keep everyone very excited, right? Well, that's what I'm going to try to figure out myself. So we're talking a bit about DNS abuse handling. And as we've spoken about several times today, security is a pretty big issue for pretty much everyone on the internet these days. And DNS abuse is one area that ICANN is deeply involved in because people use the DNS for both good purposes as well as bad purposes. So one of the key takeaways here is that, as with other discussions related to security, one of the things that we need to do is to share knowledge. One of the big challenges with dealing with DNS abuse is that it tends to be segmented into different groups. People tend to try to focus on the stuff that they see directly themselves, but not see the patterns that arise that criminals and miscreants make use of the DNS in order to pursue whatever agendas they might have. If we're able to share information about the handling of DNS abuse, we'll actually be able to have greater control over the underlying infrastructure, as well as help the various parties who are involved in combating abuse, be it law enforcement or anti-abuse organizations like APWG and MOG, to actually try to sort of stem the tide of DNS abuse as it is today. With regards to ICANN's efforts, we have, as I mentioned in my presentation earlier today, good relations with a large number of law enforcement organizations. We travel around the world providing capacity building and training to law enforcement, to government ministries, to end users, and everyone in between. We will continue to do that. In fact, one of the things that I'm doing within my team is to actually build up the team that does the capacity building. Champika here is one of our key individuals involved in the capacity building and training, particularly in the Asia-Pacific Rim region, and we're actually causing him to travel a bit further afield as we're ramping up our resources in that area. We also are a member of MOG, we're a member of APWG, we're members of FIRST, and all of these organizations that we participate in, we try to provide them information about what it is that ICANN does and what we don't do, how DNS abuse works, ways to mitigate DNS abuse, key areas to focus on, and we will continue to do that moving forward. I guess instead of me continuing to sort of blather on, I think I'll hand it over to Champika so that we can provide an overview of DNS abuses and abuse handling. Do you want to? Yeah, okay.
Thanks, David, for that intro. So as you have heard, actually, the objective of this section is to go through the DNS abuse handling aspects. And obviously, like, based on the time limit we have, we try to kind of condense our regular materials and then try to kind of, focus on a few things, especially focusing the abuse handling and considering this audience and so on. So let me just put my slides up. Okay, so I think since this morning, there have been, in fact, since yesterday, there have been a lot of talks and discussions about DNS. So I guess that you are quite familiar with some of the DNS aspects now, but mostly focusing into the DNS abuses. Now, I mean, what is really DNS abuse? Obviously, there have been like a lot of definitions, but you know, as a whole, what we are trying to do is actually to analyze, you know, what sort of badness or, you know, abuses happening in the DNS space. So things could be related to cybercrime, or, you know, things like hacking and malicious activities and so on. So our objective here is actually try to analyze these things and see how we can actually mitigate those scenarios. Now, in terms of threats related to the DNS, we can try to categorize into a number of areas. Obviously, again, you know, we have had some discussions early on as well. David spoke about DNS Sec and so on, where we try to protect DNS data. And then the cache poisoning and things like that can happen in that space. And then also there is things like DDoS or denial of service. This is also obviously, like, it's a big area talking about DDoS, but then from DNS perspective also, you know, if we can take precautions, we can try to, you know, at least, you know, try to prevent this kind of situations or DDoS type situations. There are, of course, things like privacy violations. Again, you know, the spammers and so on, they can harvest Whois data and things like that. So these are all related to some of these abuses that we are talking about. Now, why the miscreants, they are interested about DNS attacks or targeting DNS, basically, because, you know, all of us, you know, we use DNS very often and every day, you know, all the time we use DNS, whether you query, whether you browse or even send emails and things like that, we always use DNS. Basically, you know, our devices. So this is why actually the DNS has been always kind of, you know, interested target. And if anyone managed to disrupt DNS, basically, you know, that can create a big impact. It could be the especially, you know, from an e-commerce point of view nowadays, enterprise level, and various, you know, financial sectors, governments, you know, all these things, all these sectors could be interested in these areas. So there can be a lot of these exploitations could happen in the area of DNS. There could be various malicious domain name registrations, the name hijacks, and DNS data corruptions, and so on. It can go into different you know, threat levels. Now, you may have seen many of these kind of different threats nowadays, right? Starting all the way from, you know, out there are lots of these counterfeit goods are being sold. So there are abusive domains are being used for that purposes. And then things like data exfiltrations, or even there are different type of exploit attacks. Illegal pharmaceuticals, this has been becoming kind of a very big issue now. There are lots of illegal pharmaceuticals are being sold online using lots of these malicious domains. There are also actually malware command and controls, infrastructure is being used, the botnets. So these are all various things that nowadays we hear related to the DNS. Ransomware, right? Phishing attacks. Again, you know, we have had some discussions earlier about some of these things. Business email compromises. Again, another big area that is being discussed nowadays quite a lot. Scams, all sort of scams, right? The 419 scams, these are where, you know, you would be actually, you get these emails that you'll get trying to invest in different projects and things like that. So these type of scams. So these are all various scams that we see nowadays. Now, so this is actually where someone would create some malicious domains. You know, they would probably, you know, buy these malicious domain using some fake credentials or providing some fake credit cards and things like that. So they would buy these domains, and then they can actually create these things, right? Another way is, of course, maybe a legitimate website or legitimate domain, they can try to actually misuse. That's another way of doing that. So basically what they would do is they would try to get the infrastructure, and then probably the legitimate user may not know exactly their infrastructure has been used for that, so the criminals could use their DNS servers, could use their mail servers, and so on, and then try to actually do some illegal activity or abusive activity there. So there could be some malware, for example, like especially if you have even your own organizational domain, someone could actually have some malware, hosted there. Especially it could be in a subdomain, for example. So these kind of things are always possible. So these are all various threats that can happen into the DNS space, especially. So this is why actually we have to understand what sort of activities are happening, and then to handle the abuses related to these activities. So that's the whole purpose of DNS abuse handling. Now again, when you really think about this DNS abuse handling, it's not just DNS that we have to focus on, because obviously DNS, the domain names are internet identifier, but behind that we have an IP address as well. Not only the IP addresses, also there are a lot of other relevant resources and other identifiers, things like AS numbers and so on. These are all in the same ecosystem. So we have to actually consider all of that when we try to do this abuse handling. Now also actually not only the operational technical aspects, you also have to understand some of the administrative aspects as well, especially things like reporting. If you want to report some abuses, then you have to know exactly where you should be reporting these. There are so many entities in this whole ecosystem. If you consider the DNS ecosystem, there are lots of contractual relationships, especially from ICANN perspective. You can see that in this diagram, we have ICANN, and then we have registries. So ICANN has got, with the generic top-level domain registries, or we call GTLDs, we have contractual agreements, registry agreements, basically. But with the CCTLDs, or the country code top-level domains, ICANN does not have any agreements as such, because the countries are sovereign countries, jurisdictions, and so on. So there are no any contractual agreements over there. But with the generic top-level domains, there are contractual agreements. And then between the registries and registrars, also they have agreements. And then if you consider the registrars, there are also ICANN accredited registrars as well. So those ICANN accredited registrars, they have registrar agreements with ICANN. So there are these contractual processes exist between ICANN and also between the registries and registrars. So we need to actually have a understanding on that area. And then there are also resellers, because some of the big registrars, they have resellers underneath them. So there could be some agreements between the registrars and the resellers as well. And then in the end, we have the registrant, who is actually the party or the entity who registered the exact domain name. And if the registrant is registering a domain name through the registrar, then obviously there is that understanding, the term of service, or the conditions that they agree to. So all those are more of administrative context that we need to know, and as I said, we need to have some understanding on that area too, not only the operational area. So thinking, trying to actually okay, so if you try to then to see the both aspects, the administrative aspects and the operational aspects, you can see that, as you can see in this diagram, if you really see end user or the registrant who would actually send a query. So basically, say the end user want to visit a website, for example, a domain, and the end user would send a DNS request, DNS query basically, and that query would go into DNS, and then you have number of these servers within the DNS that the query would actually go into. And then there are, of course, then the registration databases that are involved. And we earlier talked about registries who manage these databases as well. And then, obviously, like the registrars and registries and so on, everyone is in this ecosystem. So we have to then understand this whole ecosystem to actually do some proper analysis and try to handle these abuses. Now, if you try to zoom into that operational area that I mentioned you earlier, the servers, you will see obviously the client machines, the end machines. So this could be your device itself, or it could be the client. And then the client would send the query to what we call these caching servers or recursive servers. So typically these servers are operated by the network operators like ISPs and so on, DNS providers, or there are public DNS providers as well who operate these public DNS servers. And then there are also what we call authoritative servers. So these are the servers that are managed by the parties, the entities who manage the databases, who are authorized for that data. So for example, if you consider the root zone is an authoritative database where we have in the root servers, right? And then similarly, if you consider the TLD databases, say for example in Taiwan we have .tw, which is the country code top-level domain. So we have the TW, they have the database that resides in TW servers, the name servers I'm talking. So all these name servers are what we call the authoritative name servers. And then underneath that, again, we have the second levels and third levels and so on. So anyway, for this data, for this authorized data, we have to have authoritative servers. So someone has to manage those. And obviously, one server will not be enough. Again, from a DNS security point of view, we have to have multiple redundancy, multiple servers to address that redundancy. So this is where we will have multiple DNS servers. Again, we have to make sure that all these servers are properly secured, and then all these security considerations, what we are discussing, is being applied to all those name servers as well. Why also actually DNS registrations are also an attractive target for the miscreants is also mainly because nowadays many things are automated, right? So easily even someone can register with fake credentials, for example, right? So it may not be just a human, possibly. It could be a bot, for example. Or even there could be even the registrar correspond with the registrant. Mostly it could be through the emails and things like that. So there can be always some sort of, abusive things can happen in that space. So this is also why, and also the other thing is there are quite a lot of inexpensive domains. I mean, you can, depending on the registry models, you can buy some free domains sometimes, or you can even buy very cheap domains. So these are all various reasons why you'll see that there are different, abusive registrations in this space. And these are very common. You may see that if you have your own domains and so on, you will see that the registrars would communicate with emails. At the same time, the miscreants can also create this kind of emails. It could be phishing emails where the user who is not really aware of some of these things can easily click these links and go to wrong places, wrong websites, and so on, phishing sites, and provide their credentials easily. So these are very common nowadays. And another perspective, of course, from DNS point of view is the DDoS attacks. I think we have had some discussions on this earlier as well. But especially from a DNS point of view, how we can try to actually protect our space or try to protect or try to actually reduce the DDoS is better management of our recursive servers. Earlier I mentioned you about the recursive servers. Now, usually, typically, how it happens is that the attacker or the miscreant could fake the identity of the of an victim. So, and once the impersonation is being done or the identity is being spoofed, then the query would go to a recursive server, and then the recursive server would actually go and find the answer through an authoritative server, but the answer is not really given to the attacker, but obviously the answer would go into the victim because victim's identity has been spoofed. Why this happened? Mainly because there are so many, from a DNS perspective, there are so many open recursive servers out there now. If you really consider that, you know, there are millions, right? So this is quite a lot. So for example, like if the miscreant managed to actually get hold of one of those and then redirect all those queries into an innocent victim, then if you multiply that into, you know, maybe thousands or more than that, then a heavy load will get into that victim. And this can be actually multiplied in drastically if there are sort of millions of servers out there. So these are what we call open recursive servers. Why do we have this? Because mainly, like, if someone is running a recursive server, they are happy to provide the recursion to anyone. So this should not be the case. If anyone is providing a recursive service, they should be selective. Say, for example, if you are a network operator, there might be some of the network operators here. There could be some ISPs here. So if you are providing recursion to your customers, you should be having some access controls there. You should be providing recursion only to your customers, for example. You don't want to provide recursion to outside your customers. Say, for example, if I'm an ISP, why would I provide recursion to the clients who are not really my customers, right? I don't want to spend my resources, my processing power, or my memory, or my bandwidth, and things like that for the others, you know, unknown clients' use. So this is where actually you have to have some access controls in your recursive servers, and also things like rate limiting, where you can actually, if you see that same type of queries coming in from these clients, you know, you should try to limit those. That's what we call the rate limiting. So these kind of mechanisms should be implemented at the recursive server level. Then the poisoning of cache. Again, this is very common nowadays, right? Obviously, like, this can be done in many ways as well. Someone could run their own authoritative server. Say, for example, you know, they could get a legitimate domain, and they could register a legitimate authoritative domain and a server. They could run their own server. So basically, the miscreant, the attacker, could be running their own server, and then they want to get all these client requests to their authoritative server. So they could try to put, you know, all the nice stuff over there in their authoritative server. It could be a very nice, attractive URL or a domain, and then so that their main objective would be to actually get as much as traffic into their domain. And then because it's their authoritative servers which are really responding based on that name, so, you know, based on that domain, right, to the clients. So when the recursive server actually asks for anything about this particular domain, obviously in the response, they can always have extra information, or what we call additional information, where the caching servers can keep this information in the caches. So if the caching server does not have proper security mechanisms in place, they could remember some false information in their caches, in the caching server. So obviously, like, say, if a fake IP address gets into a caching server, say, for example, for a proper domain, say for any proper domain, a fake IP address gets into the cache, that means for whatever time that cache exists in that recursive server, all the clients who are asking any information about that particular authoritative domain will get the wrong IP address from the caching server. So ultimately, then the client will go and visit a wrong domain or a wrong website, basically, right? So that's kind of a phishing attack. So these are, again, very common nowadays. Another way is actually even hijacking even DNS. This is also possible, right? There is always possible that DNS can be used as a covered channel for malware, things like. So for example, that as we know in DNS, say for example, if you have a firewall could be allowing things like port 53 traffic. So someone could still use to get through the firewall, so they could still use some of the DNS records. Say, for example, we have records like TXT records in DNS zones. So someone could actually, if you want to give some commands, if you want to give some messages to your command and control, the server, they could actually send those messages through, say, embedded in a text record, right? So that the firewall can, exempt that. So firewall will not really look into that. So things like that. So someone can actually use this kind of method to actually cover the channel and then get through their messages through the firewall. So these are all, there are various bots in the past that has used this kind of methodologies actually to actually get through the firewalls and things like that. So these are all various ways that someone can actually threaten DNS. Now, another common thing what you see in the DNS is actually this fast flux attacks. So this is where, say for example, earlier we talked about caching servers. Now, these caching servers, there are things called these TTL values or time to live values. Say for example, if I'm a recursive server, when I get an answer, I keep that in my memory, in my cache, for the time that is defined in that TTL or the time to live value. So if the TTL value is, say, 1 day, I would keep that answer in my memory for 1 day. But if the TTL value is, say, if it's 1 hour, I will keep the answer for 1 hour. And if the TTL value is, say 5 minutes, I will keep the answer for 5 minutes. That's it. So the miscreants can actually use this. Of course, like there are good behaviors here as well. Say, for example, these IP addresses and things like that can be changed to balance the load. This is one possibility always. But the same thing can be done to actually create some sort of fast flux attacks. So that, say, for example, the miscreant would not really want to keep the answers for too long in the caches. Because obviously, like, if, say, for example, if someone is from a law enforcement or if some investigators, if they're doing some more investigations and things like that, it is quite risky to have these answers exist in the caches for a very long time. So if you keep that for, say, 1 day, there's high possibility that the IP address can be recovered, or basically, it can get leaked and things like that. So that is why the miscreants, they would try to change the IP addresses very often. So you will see these kind of fast flux services very often. These things can be done on name servers, the TTLs, or even web servers, web proxies, and so on, so that always you can have a pool of these IP addresses that can be changed time to time in a very often manner. So poisoning of host, DNS hijacks. Also, I mentioned you, right? So DNS hijacks. Some years ago, also there was this malware, DNS changer, that affected many devices in the world. And so this was basically it was a malware that once you visit the malware site, the malware gets downloaded into the device. And then once the malware gets downloaded to the device, malware would change the DNS settings in the client device. So if in the client device, if the DNS settings are changed, obviously the client wouldn't know what DNS server that you'd be using. Now the DNS settings have been all changed, so the queries could be going to a wrong DNS server, which is controlled by the attacker in this case, right? So this was actually one of the examples, the DNS changer. So these kind of things can happen, right? So the malware can change DNS settings. So these are what we call DNS hijacks. Even actually sometimes when we travel around, so we see that in public places and so on, we see these free Wi-Fi hotspots and so on. Sometimes we connect to those. When we see some when we see in free Wi-Fi hotspots in public places, the thing is that the risk, always there's a risk, because you're using someone else's infrastructure, so someone else's DNS servers could be serving you and so on, right? So there is always possibility of hijacking those DNS queries. So these are all various ways that the DNS space can be abused. Now, sometimes it is very hard to identify whether, considering these domains, whether it's really a malicious domain or whether it is actually a victimized domain. As I told you before, it could be just a malicious domain that someone has purposefully created for that purpose, or it could be that maybe they have just misused a legitimate domain for some bad purpose. That is also always possible. So one thing when you do your DNS abuse handling is that you'll have to actually see exactly, try to find more and more evidences and see actually how this case is it a malicious domain, or is it a misused domain, and things like that. So there are various things that you can actually look into, especially like, this is not the whole list as such, but these are some of the things that you could be aware when you do some DNS abuse handling. For example, that you can always go and check the recent domain registration creation date. Now, obviously, like when you look for Whois database, as we all know now, with GDPR and so on, there are some fields that are being masked that you won't see, especially like person's information and things like that. But still, some information still can be seen, right? So you can still use some of those information for your abuse handling purposes. But still, if you are law enforcement and so on, there are still procedures available. Even if you want to get the other mask information, there are some layered approaches available through the process, through the system. So recent domain creation date, usually typically when someone wants to create some abusive thing, they might get a domain for that purpose. So that may not be very long. You don't have to, they may not have created like 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So it could be just maybe only like maybe a few days ago, possibly, right? So always like those kind of things should have some red light blinking, when you see some of those things. It doesn't mean that all the new creation dates are all the abusive domains, but when you see some of those things, you can put a red tick over there. Okay, you might want to further check on those. Then there are things like Whois data, questionable data, because sometimes when you go and have a look at the Whois data, you may see that, okay, this is not really correct. Again, there are processes involved related to the Whois reporting. If there are some inaccurate data and so on, there are processes that you can report that inaccurate data. Privacy protection services. There are privacy protection providers out there. Obviously, like some of the miscreants, if they are using it for abusive purposes, they may want to hide their information. So they may use some privacy protection service. So again, if you see some privacy protection services or service providers out there, the proxies, privacy proxies, you might want to actually deal with them. So again, you'll have to contact them for those purposes. And then suspicious value of DNS zone data, as I told you before, things like TTL values. If you can always actually do some queries and check for TTL values. You can look for the zone records, right? So, for example, you can look for SOA record, and then you can see what are the TTL values. If you see like TTL values are the time to live values are quite small, for example, like say 5 minutes, then that should again blink some red light there, right? So because, why would someone want to put a very small value unless if there is any specific reason? There are, of course, some valid purposes, as I told you before, for, load balancing and things like that. But you just have to, again, always when you do these DNS abuse handling, it's not just one thing that you're looking for. Always we try to look for many things, right? So it's all, we try to find many things and try to, put everything into a big picture and then try to analyze that big picture. That's the important thing. A lot of these attackers, miscreants, they use confusing brand names. They could be spoofing some of those confusing brand names. Again, even this morning David shows some of the confusing name as well, using some IDNs. So these things can always be tricky, right? There are some known domain generation algorithms, right? So the DGS can be used to create lots of these domains. So this is a technique that they use. So many, it could be maybe in a single day, thousands of domains could be generated. But in actual fact, only few could be registered and used for malicious purposes. So it can be very hard sometimes if you have to go and check, hundreds or thousands of, all these domains. In this case, again, having some DNS monitoring would help, because if you have a lot of these invalid domains, you'll get NX domain responses. Because when you ask about invalid domain, obviously the DNS server will respond, no, I can't find it. It's a negative response, right? So if you can monitor all those negative responses, okay, something going on bad. I mean, something is not right, because you get a lot of these NX domain responses coming back, right? Then suspicious or notorious name servers. Sometimes even in real life, if we have these norms, especially, okay, some areas, you don't go into those areas in the real life, because we see that those areas could be maybe not very safe, right? We say, okay, don't go into that area is not very safe. The same here, right? So there are some name servers which you'll see, like most of the domains that are being served by those name servers are not really good domains. It could be malicious domains. So if you can find out those kind of name servers, then if you can find maybe a list of more domains that are being served by that name server, then you will have access to even more, actually, more domains. And also you can come to some sort of a conclusion, or not really a conclusion, but at least to some sort of understanding that this name server may not be the right one, or may not be a good one, right? Yeah, so suspicious name servers. And then usually when many of these miscreants, when they do these kind of activities, they don't want to do it in a very perfect style, or in a very accurate way sometimes, right? Even when you try to create a zone file itself, you'll see some errors. So these are also little things that you can observe if you're doing some investigations, if you are looking into some zone files and things like that. You may find some errors, for example. You may find some typing mistakes. You may find things, that not very organized properly, right? Because someone could be doing this in a hurry. So these are all little things that you might want to observe in a zone file, right? Yeah, so errors. And then again, just like before, the notorious or suspicious hosting locations, right? So these where even if you use some tools like reputation services can be helpful, because those reputation tools can give you a kind of a score, so that you have some sort of a idea whether these hosting locations are kind of, what sort of rating you have in terms of their reputation. Same goes to the ISPs as well, right? The service providers, network operators. always it's a very good practice from a network operator's point of view. If you are operating a network, if you are providing some DNS services and so on, have your acceptable user policy, published, so that you have all the terms and conditions, right? Terms of service, so that even if, say, for example, if I get a lot of spam from a certain domain, if I want to lodge a spam complaint, abuse complaint, I have to know exactly what's the process, what email ID I should be sending those, and in case if someone spam from your network, what is action that you'll be taking? Are you going to actually take any legal action, or are you going to give some warnings, things like that? So these kind of things should be published. So this is how even we can actually assess whether the service provider is a good service provider, or a kind of, someone who doesn't really care about these things, right? So these are things that always you can watch when you do these investigations. And then sometimes also you will see that the base site content sometimes could be very normal, right? It could be because, especially, say, think about, say in a university, for example, right? So because you will have lots of departments, or they could be having different in the same server. You could be having different directories and so on, right? So the base site could actually, it could be just normal. Whereas if you go into maybe a subdomain, there could be some abuses happening over there, or maybe some abusive content could be hosted there, or malicious stuff could be hosted there in a subdomain, for example. So you might want to observe those things as well. And then, the list goes on, right? So there are various things that you can look into when you try to find these abusive things related to domains. Even things like suspicious mail headers. When you look at emails, for example, right? You can always look for the email headers and look for the domains. Even things like not only domains, also actually the reverse domains as well. So this is something that you could check the reverse side of it, whether it's mapping to the IP addresses and things like that, right? So these are all things that you can check before you actually process your reporting with related to these abuse complaints. Now, it is always, the bottom line is actually it's not always very easy to analyze these or identify these badness. The criminals also, they will try to evade as much as possible, right? So they can confuse you quite a lot. They could be using a lot of redirections, for example. So you might see that, say even you'll see some very long URLs sometimes, right? Or even very short URLs, for example, right? So they may have shortened it, or even those ones could be even further shortened, right? So there could be a lot of redirections going on. So before you just do any investigations, then you might want to actually expand that URL first. There are tools where you can expand the URLs, right? So you might want to see those. If you are talking about, say, a website, then you might want to see the source, right? The view source, and then have a look at those exact URL. So because we may not see the exact thing out there in the website, right? So you might want to see exactly where it's redirecting into. People could be using one-time URLs. These are all different ways that the miscreants can try to actually confuse you, right? They could be actually having some subdomains, as I mentioned you before, country-specific scripts, IDNs. There are various IDN-based threats, right? So they could, just like what David showed in the morning, the Gmail. There are many of those type of things happen in the past as well. And all those, even considering some of these identification details, there are instances where some of these miscreants, they have used, say, for example, like dead people's credentials, right? So if you see in the Whois entries, you could see, okay, that person is not really living, he's a dead person, right? So there are lots of these kind of inaccuracies they can try to use to confuse the investigators or confuse like the incident handling people. So basically, the criminals, they use a lot of impersonation, right? So you need to be aware of that. So they want to hide as much as possible. So when you try to do your abuse handling, now again, as I mentioned to you earlier, it's not just DNS. There are so many things that relates to this, not just DNS, right? Because behind the domain name, there's an IP address. Then we talked about the reverse domains as well, right? Whether it's really mapping, that IP address is really mapping to the domain. Then there could be some mail servers, right? So if you say, for example, if you find a domain, malicious domain, you can find out, okay, what are the zone data related to that? So you can find some zone data. If you want to find the zone data, again, there are tools available where you can actually query. Either you can use command line tools, or there are other public domain tools as well where you can use. So basically, you can do a lot of research into the zone data itself. And if you can find a lot of zone data, then we have more information related to our investigation. And things like the mail servers. If you can find the mail servers, probably we can even find the IP addresses of the mail servers and see actually who has provided, which operator is actually providing those. And if you want to actually further investigate, further lodge any complaints with them, you can still do with that channel. And then you can also look into the databases like Whois databases. Again, talking about Whois databases, there are domain Whois and then the numbers, the IP Whois. So domain Whois is, of course, handled by the domain registries, registrars, right? Whereas the IP Whois is actually managed by the regional internet registries and national internet registries as well. So you might want to actually go and check more into those databases and find more information. Not only the IP address related information, also about autonomous system numbers, AS numbers, right? There have been some, again, there were some discussions about RPKI before. Even to understand about, okay, whether there are any other sort of different behaviors and things like that, you can find more details about those type of resources as well in the databases. Passive DNS, this is also another thing that can be quite useful. Especially if you want to find out more details, say, earlier I told you, like if you know a certain name server, right, say some abusive name server, if you want to find out, okay, what other domains are being served by that name server, you can actually go into a passive database, some tools that are provided by the passive databases and find more information about those. Then obviously, a whole lot about this, these things you can even relate to social media and so on, because nowadays, we have a lot of relevance you can make it to social media, right? So if you find some details, if you find some personal contacts, or if you find some even any address-related information, you can email addresses and things like that. You can also use social media to do some further investigations. Now, with the time limit, of course, I won't go into too much details of tools and things like that, but these are some of the useful tools that are available in the public domain, right, that can be useful in handling abuses related to these internet identifiers. For example, you can use Dig. Dig is very useful tool. Either you can use it in command line, or you can, if you don't have command line, you can still use web interface to do Dig. Whois databases, I told you before, you can find a lot of information. And if you want to further escalate, there are some layered approaches that you can escalate based on the current status with GDPR. Domain tools can find some more, again, can give a lot of information related to the identify information, domains, where it's registered, the location, geolocations, and things like that. Then domain dossier, again, can provide a lot of information, including the zone data and so on. Security trails can give a lot of historical DNS data, right? Again, this could be very useful, especially like, because I told you that sometimes the caches can be, the TTL values can be very small. So you might not find enough information. Even actually another very important point is that when you're doing these investigations, if you find something, always very good to document that. So you can redirect into a file and save it. Because what you see now, in the next 1 hour, you might not see that, right? So this is why it's always important to document that, save it in a file, so that you have that information with you. The RIPE NCC, they have the RIPE stats, can get a lot of information there. Passive DNS tools, I told you before. Virus total, especially if you are investigating some URLs, domains, and so on, you can use, because some URLs could contain malware and things like that. So always it's good to check on those rather than just using those directly. So virus total, URL query, malware domain list, these are again very useful in terms of finding more malicious domains. Team Camry has got a lot of resources, some tools. You can again find more information on the routing aspects, the AS numbers, and so on, right? Okay, now when you try to go and take some actions, for example, right? So say, for example, now you have found some malicious domains, and if you want to take some actions and so on, you will also have to actually see whether is this action, how it's going to impact, right? This action that you're going to do, how it's going to impact on the whole DNS ecosystem, right? So who is involved in the first place? Because we talked about so many entities, so many parties, right? Things like, are you going to take the action on the registrant, or is it the registrar, or the ISP, or the registry, whoever it is, like who is the party, right? So that is very important to know. And then what is the goal, right? Goal of this action. And then is it going to be synchronized with the others? Because sometimes if you are working on some investigation, there could be some others, right? There could be others also doing some investigations on this. So for example, if you take some action, that can impact others who are doing that investigation, right? So this is why you have to have some coordination, collaboration. So before you take any action, have that collaboration, coordination with others as well who are doing some investigation on the same thing, right? And then also, of course, you need to actually think about, of course, if you have taken some action, what are the other consequences? Say, for example, if you try to bring down a domain, right? And what about the traffic now? After that point onwards, what about the traffic that's going there, right? Are you going to redirect that, or are you going to actually what sort of action? Are you going to still have some notice in that page, or things like that? What sort of reactive action that you're going to take after that? And then what about the Whois records? What it should display, right? The servers, all that records. And all those things has to be properly planned, right, before you take those actions. That's important. So minimizing the collateral harm is quite important in such incident, right, when you're handling these kind of situations. So there are a lot of questions that you might want to ask yourself. Things like, if you take this action, whether it can disrupt the whole more other users or more other domains. So for example, if you just bring down one domain, it could really affect so many others, especially, right? So it is important to actually understand that aspect as well, right? And then what other services can affect from your action. It could be mail services that can be affected. It could be web services that can be affected. All those other services. What are you going to do with all that? And then also the other, as I mentioned to you earlier, the other ongoing investigations happening. So it's better to have some understanding on those and then try to work on those. Now, if you just try to summarize what I was just trying to say in this process, like when you want to handle some abuses, these are some steps actually you can think of. Say, for example, first thing is collection of as much as possible, collection of data or the information as much as possible. That is important, right? It's not just only about the domain name, but also even the other surrounding things, as I told you, right? Things like IP address, things like mail servers, things like the other related Whois information, and all that. So you have the big picture with you now. And then when you lodge your abuse complaint, when you lodge your report, all that information is useful to anyone who is going to do that investigation. It could be the CERT, it could be the law enforcement, it could be the incident response team of that service provider, and so on, right? Whoever it is. So it's very important for you to provide all that information. And also in a proper way, in a proper, of course, some entities could provide some standard templates in this case. But even if you don't provide some, if you don't see some templates, then you might want to actually put that in a proper way. Contacting the hosting providers, registrar, abuse desk, these are all useful, right? So you can find those abuse desk contact details through the Whois records and so on. Again, we had some discussions on that, so I won't go into too much details. And then also looking at the terms of service, terms and conditions, right? AUPs, also useful, because you know that exactly what is the action that you can take with related to that. If there are no successes, you can contact the, say for example, if you don't get good success from the registrar, you can still go to registry and talk about that. And then also, actually, if you want to further escalate, there are, of course, the national certs, and then the law enforcement. Even from ICANN perspective, we have a compliance department as well, especially with related to any breach of contracts and things like that. Then the compliance department can help you with that. There is also Whois data reporting process available as well if you think there are some inaccurate data. So you can also do that. Now, there are lots of discussions happening from a policy perspective within ICANN forum with related to DNS abuse handling, especially things like Whois accuracy. There are discussions on that. Again, with the whole Whois, revamping the whole Whois, the RDS, the RDAP. So there's a lot of discussion happening over there. Gdpr is another area, especially in this, especially if you are from law enforcement and so on, you could be interested. Within the ICANN, we have GAC, the Government Advisory Committee, and within that, we also have something called PSWG, Public Safety Working Group, especially for law enforcement and so on. They can be involved and provide their input towards what's happening in the policy area. And then the reporting the abuses. So this is another area where ICANN is actually, there are some tools probably. I will stop here, and David also can probably talk about some of those tools, like DAR, for example, and then possibly give some understanding about, to give you some idea about some of these abuse handling that we have done, how ICANN has been involved, especially with some of the example cases in the past. Thank you.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions or comments at this stage of the proceedings? Doesn't look like it. Okay. To give people a sort of a brief description, an explanation of DAR, the DNS Abuse Activity Reporting System, we spoke a bit about that earlier today. DAR is a system that we have had set up that collects information from a series of reputation providers. And one of the underlying principles behind DAR is we wanted to make sure that everyone could, if they were interested in, reproduce what we're seeing with DAR. So the methodology by which we have set up DAR, the reputation feeds that we use, all of it is publicly documented. We collect these reputation information from a number of different feeds. And then we compute some very simple statistics based on that. Basically, the the average amount of abuse for zones, and when we talk about abuse in the context of DAR, it's the abuse that was listed by the Government Advisory Committee in the Beijing communique, namely phishing, botnet command and control, and malware distribution. We also, in I think the Abu Dhabi communique, the GAC added spam, so that's something else that we track. Spam's a bit controversial because a lot of people don't see it as infrastructure abuse, they see it more as content abuse. The way we approach spam is it's an indicator of abuse, not necessarily abusive in and of itself, and it's also a vector by which different forms of abuse are actually implemented within the DNS. Since, when, I guess around February, we've been publishing a monthly report on DAR. If you go to ICANN's website /DAR, you can see the methodology paper, reviews of the methodology. We had actually hired 2 folks from the external community to review DAR to provide us input on what we did right and what we did wrong, and recommendations to improve DAR. And the monthly reports. We have monthly reports going back for about 6 months, and we will continue to provide those reports moving forward. In the future, what we plan on doing with DAR is opening up an API that allows registries to see their own information with regards to where they stand in the abuse rankings relative to the averages that are made available via the public reports. We have not yet gotten to the point of naming names within DAR. We want to work with the community to make sure everybody's comfortable with that. What we've seen is that privately, a lot of registries are very happy with the DAR information, but publicly there's a bit of reluctance to fully embrace it. And we want to make sure everybody's comfortable with DAR moving forward to provide information that will inform policy discussions. We're also planning on including CCTLDs that voluntarily want to add their information into DAR. And we're intending on opening up additional APIs to allow for additional statistics to be gathered. One of the comments that we had is the way we compute the information in the final report is we take a snapshot of a single day. And that obviously has some advantages and disadvantages. So we're looking to provide additional statistics that will allow people to have a greater picture of how the system, or how DNS abuse is being implemented across all the top-level domains that we have data for. With that, I guess, anything else we want to touch on?
Any examples?
You mean the avalanche and sort of stuff? Sure. So some of the examples that, in ways in which we're working with the anti-abuse community. The most recent example is in the context of the DNS hijacking that I mentioned in my presentation earlier today. The DNS hijacking attacks are ongoing, and they involve a wide variety of actors. ICANN was dragged into the DNS hijacking mitigation efforts because a number of CCTLDs approached us requesting emergency changes. They'd been informed by their back-end providers that there was a potential for compromise because of the way the back-end provider had set up the systems, and they wanted to, at the recommendation of their back-end provider, change the delegations for the top-level domains to try to minimize the hijacking risk. As a result of that, we were contacted by a number of people who were involved in detecting and trying to mitigate the DNS hijacking efforts. And we've been working with them in an internal trust group where communication is highly contained to try to identify the potential vectors by which the attacks were occurring, provide the contact information for various players who either have been attacked in an attempt to mitigate those attacks, or who have been involved in one way or another, for example, by providing infrastructure for the attacks. In general, we found that the folks who are being used as infrastructure for the attacks have been fairly responsive. We haven't had as much luck in getting responses from the victims of the attack. One of the challenges that we've seen is that the victims think that someone contacting them, telling them they've been attacked, is either assumed to be a phishing attack in and of itself, or it's someone trying to sell them products or services. So that's one area that we're going to try to be working with in the various GNSO and CCNSO policy bodies to try to figure out a better way in which we can contact folks who we have relations with in the event that attacks are occurring. In the past, we've also been involved with takedowns associated with botnets like Avalanche and Andromeda. These were sort of large-scale attacks. We also were involved with Conficker. In those cases, the role we performed was very similar in that we provided introductions and information to potential targets of the botnets or other attacks. And we liaise with law enforcement and other anti-abuse organizations, explaining to them how the DNS works, what ICANN's role is, what ICANN does and doesn't do, and those sort of things, trying to facilitate better understanding of the environment in which the attacks were taking place and how best to mitigate those attacks. We continue to provide that service for law enforcement and anti-abuse organizations around the world, and will continue to do so in the future. And anything else we want to say about that? Nope. Okay. I guess at this stage, we'll open it up to any questions, comments, screams of outrage. Not seeing anything? Great. Then I guess we will hand it back and maybe get out a little early.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for joining joining us at ICANN APAC TWNIC Engagement Forum. We have reached the end of the forum, and we hope this event will bring some new insights and thoughts to you. With your participation, we will be able to bring the safety, diversity, openness, and accessibility to the internet along with other stakeholders. Thank you. And also remind you that you can complete our survey by using your phone to scan the back of your card, and we will have gifts at the counter if you present your screen to them. Thank you.